Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Inside the Psychopathic Mind podcast. Your host again, Jason Smith with Carl Giacono. And again, joining us is Dr. Todd Roy. He's going to help us talk about today is our topic on Bundy. So in comparison to Charles Manson, who we talked about in another podcast episode, and we've worked an article together where we've kind of compared and contrasted the Rorschachs of both Ted Bundy and Charles Manson. And if you want to take a look at that article, there'll be a link in the description. But again, thank you both, Todd and Carl, for joining.
Well, yeah, I think. Go ahead, Todd.
Well, I'm glad to be here and to be brought in on this, given the transition from Manson to Bundy.
Yes.
I've never seen a protocol on Bundy, so this is going to be interesting to me and new learning, so to speak. And if I can make a contribution, I will do so.
Yeah. Oh, you already have, Todd. I think one of our inroads to this is the comment you made about Manson in the Manson presentation, where, yes, you mentioned when I said he didn't fit in, you said the one place he fit in was prison. Well, one of the things that distinguishes between these two individuals is Bundy, in a perceivable way, seemed to fit in more or less into society, even though he didn't. So, I mean, that's a big branching off point for comparing to Manson itself. Bundy didn't have the life in prison that Manson did. And even though both these people scoreable by the PCLR would tend to be out psychopathic, they're quite different. And one of the things that distinguishes Bundy is the sexual sadism, which we'll turn to in a moment. But let's talk first about where we got the protocols. This Bundy protocol came to me through, it was a presentation for the International Rorschach Society, where I was asked to kind of score the Rorschach and comment on it. For Bundy's Rorschach, and it was a panel where several other people were on it. So it was nice to have this protocol and be able to go over it in that fashion, and nice to bring it to the three of us as we kind of compared and contrasted Ted Bundy with Manson. One of the things that is little known because it didn't come out till later in life is some things about Ted Bundy's childhood related to his behavior. And behaviors that actually are consistent with someone that would grow up to be a sexual sadist, which is someone who gains pleasure from the sexual gratification and inflicting pain, that combination of pain and gratification at the same time. One of the things that came out later in life is some of Bundy's early childhood behavior, which I'll kind of read, and it's off Wikipedia. Bundy exhibit disturbing behavior even at an early age. His youngest sister recalled awakening from a nap to find herself surrounded by knives from the kitchen, and 3-year-old Bundy standing by the bed smiling. Another individual, a childhood neighbor, recalled Bundy as a mean-spirited kid who liked to inflict pain and suffering and fear. According to someone else, Bundy once engaged in animal cruelty by hanging a stray cat from the backyard clothesline and setting it on fire with lighter fluid. She also claimed that he would take younger children into the woods, force them to strip, and proceed to terrorize them. You'd hear them screaming for blocks. I mean, no matter where we were, we could hear them screaming. Bundy reportedly built makeshift bungee traps around the neighborhood, injuring at least one girl. Another thing with Bundy related to his early behavior, he was actually arrested, I believe, for burglary and breaking and entering during his adolescence, which is a scoreable thing for the PCLR, the psychopathy checklist, but the records were sealed. So some of this information is kind of newer, but it's real consistent with someone will do a sexual homicide. The kind of idea you can see the fantasies developing early in life. Often the fantasies are in adolescence will include masturbating to violent sexual activity and pornography, where the violence and the relationship kind of things become fused as one and the same. And I think, Todd, you had an interesting comment about relationships and kind of the way you see it. I hope I'm striking the chord with what you had mentioned.
Yeah, I my comment was the aggression that was coordinated with a longing for a relationship. And it's almost the only way he could have a relationship is if there was violence involved, which kind of keys into his sexual sadism. Having a normal relationship just was unsatisfactory unless there was some kind of coercion and some kind of overpowering, it seems.
Yes, you know, Todd, I think about it, he mentioned in a number of places to different people how he didn't understand relationships or the nuances of them. And he kind of felt like a loner and an outsider. And when you think about that infusion of the aggression with the relationship, I think that we had an interesting response from another serial killer who was a sexual homicide perpetrator on the Rorschach test. What he said is he looked on one card and he said, this is two animals. The claws are reaching for each other. A hummingbird or prey because the talons are sharp. They're reaching out to be together. One is lonely and wants a relationship with the other. Now, when we think about our adult relationships, usually they're infused with some sort of empathy or fuzziness or some sort of softness. Whereas I think that captures kind of your statement, how they view relationships internally.
Mm-hmm.
They're wanting them. It's almost like what we see on the Rorschach. We did a study many years ago in '95 with Reed Malloy, myself, and Bridges, and we had 38 sexual homicide perpetrators. And what you see in their Rorschachs is that infusion of the aggression, which things that should be relationship oriented. And you also see, which tends to be quite different than Manson, his relationships were for manipulation, gain, prostituting the women's to get people doing this and that, always using other people or objects. The problem with the sexual homicide perpetrators, they have these desires for relationships, but the nature of the relationship is infused with their fantasy life and their deviant sexual behavior and fantasies. It would almost be better if they lacked any desire to connect with another person.
Yeah, they seem to be driven based on the fantasies in that regard.
Yes.
In a way, you know, Manson was driven by security on some level in terms of surrounding himself with people that basically he had convinced that he was should be adored and listened to. I don't know about Bundy, though. It looks like even though he had some degree of charisma, you know, to present himself normally in structured situations like law school or he was involved in a help center of some kind. So superficially,
yes.
Yeah, superficially he could do it, but part of it, the underlying elements of that, he was not very successful because of his orientation towards sexual fantasy and control and power over another individual.
Yes, the Rorschachs kind of display those differences. Where Manson would have these indices that he just couldn't fit in, he couldn't make it. Bundy would have a lot of these indices. They're called populars, which indicate kind of being able to get through superficially, or at least make an adjustment, or at least at times knowing the right things to do. But like other sexual sadists, what the Rorschach also brings out with Bundy is a lot of these unmet needs and obsessions that press for expression. One of the things we see on the Rorschach with sexual homicide perpetrators and some sex offenders is elevated number of responses. This just means that there's a lot going on inside that's always pressing for expression and to get out. And unfortunately, with people like Bundy, what's in there is aggression infused with sexuality. Like it just fits that pattern. It would be much better if they did not have that desire. Yeah. The Rorschach of Bundy will show kind of being stimulated and enticed by environmental stimuli and an inability to disconnect from the environment, which once again, it would be a different picture if he was more isolated and wasn't seeking out relationships of any time, because the seeking out of relationships, what you see present itself is what you would see in his behaviors, which, as people know, he was into necrophilia. He sometimes dismembered the head and would take the head with him as a trophy, and he would go back and revisit the body of his victims.
Interesting. I was thinking in terms of, you know, Manson and sex in terms of he would ingratiate himself with a very vulnerable, insecure woman and then start working on her, mentally and gain control of them to do his bidding in a lot of respects, bidding in terms of supporting him, bidding in terms of trying to bring other men into his realm. Just an interesting pattern in terms of how he used sex to support himself more than anything else. It's different, very different.
Yeah, the sex almost for him, it has a secondary quality to it.
Right.
It's a different purpose. Where with the sexual sadist, the sex is part of the gratification when it's infused with kind of inflicting pain on the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And we see this, the need to possess the person, which Bundy talked about, Dahmer talked about. We see this in a bunch of individuals. And for the life of me, I've never solved the puzzle of why you need to dismember the head in order to do that. Now, keeping the head, yes, for different sexual acts. I think Jason and I wrote about a case where a woman was the girlfriend of a serial killer that did this. And in her participation in part, she would take the dismembered head, keep it in the refrigerator, and she would put eye makeup and makeup on the head. And then he would take it in the shower and perform different sexual acts. So I guess some behaviors is so bizarre for me that I can't even understand it completely.
Yeah. It's interesting, though. There's some reports of Charlie using sex to dominate and to humiliate, which is, it doesn't seem something that he would practice, but there are instances where he did exactly that, to dominate and humiliate.
I wonder about that, Todd, because I see it as the secondary to the psychopathy and just another aspect of it. I wonder if he would have sexual fantasies that had to do with domination and or inflicting pain, or if this was just something he did.
Well, I think that was his first exposure.
Yes.
He was dominated and intimidated by bigger boys in his early incarcerations or residences and Gabalt Boys School and the like. But one of his closer acolytes, or for lack of a better term, he anally raped her, and as some form of punishment. And that's only one reported instance, but I'm pretty sure there were others that haven't been reported. Because if you're doing that, and that's been your experience in terms of dominating and trying to control the situation, so he's capable of it, but he didn't have a practice of it like Bundy.
Like part of it's related to his impaired empathy,
Right.
lack of remorse. He just doesn't care about people and objects are to be used. Versus the pure sexual sadist, you'll see these behaviors starting early in life. Oh, bless you. They'll take on a life of their own when they're combined with the masturbation during adolescence. And this is the fantasies. They'll look at violent pornography. They'll read detective magazines. This becomes kind of their obsession. And you'll actually find, like we did with Bundy's Rorschach protocol, elements that indicate obsessive thinking, and such. And also the abuse of fantasy, which means he's fantasizing about these things that then show up in the content of the Rorschach.
Right. That would contribute to his drive and desire to at least satisfy them, but was fairly obvious he was never really satisfied, because there would be a period of time that he wouldn't be engaged in these behaviors, but he always was drawn to them in some respects to satisfy his internal emptiness.
Yes. You can't get away from it, even if you think like it. Maybe we resist eating chocolate ice cream or something. For this, it's so ingrained in who they are, they have to come back to it after a cooling off period.
Right.
And then they see that person walking down the street that may be an idealized image of someone from their past or someone that rejected them or something like that. And then it's too enticing. They can't get away from it. They can't eliminate that obsession or distraction once that is the focus.
Yeah. Has to satisfy the urge to be satisfied in some respects.
So I guess we can kind of talk a little bit about some of the psychopathic traits and things that Ted Bundy kind of would display. Or so I think in the article that we wrote, what did we say about normally when you did your trainings, Carl, between 32 and 34 on the PCLR, but might be
Yeah.
higher now.
Yeah, higher with this additional data. The fact that he
Okay.
actually did crimes that he was arrested for during adolescence and this early childhood behavior. Because we used to have difficulty scoring those items and have to give it an omit because we didn't have the data. But now he wouldn't be that far from Manson. I'd
Yeah, it'd
say
be
that
roughly similar.
they'd be similar.
Yeah.
And that's an important point, Jason, because despite being similar on the PCLR, look at the richness in the Rorschach for differentiating these two people who were quite different beyond their psychopathy.
And, obviously a lot different in terms of their crimes, right? So I think we talked with Manson about the upbringing, but Bundy's upbringing was a little different too. He thought his mom was his sister, his grandparents was his parents. So a couple of different weird family dynamics kind of growing up. But for the most part, unlike Manson, who was kind of in and out of juvenile and stuff like that, Bundy went to college. He got accepted into Utah Law School. He worked at a crisis center we talked about. He was in political parties and things like that. So kind of adding to some of those, just trying to fit in, trying to kind of that chameleon, kind of going into some of those different things. And then when it comes to, he escaped prison twice or jail twice. And then a lot of the times people, when they talk about Bundy, they think about, murdering adult women, but he's obviously also murdered children as well. The sexual sadism and things like that we talked about, luring his victims in with either broken arms or legs or things like that. And I think they said by the time he was executed, I guess maybe at least 30 murders in 7 different states was kind of what I saw. So a whole bunch of different types of kidnapping and obviously sexual sadism. And I think going to the sexual sadism, I think one of the reasons that they were able to find him when he murdered a couple of people at that FSU sorority is he bit one of them on the buttocks, and then they took dental records to match it up on him. So adding to that kind of sexual sadism that he has unfortunately been known for in his scores and his stories and stuff like that.
The dental work, that forensic, whatever that's called, is that was one of the first cases, I think. You can correct me if I'm wrong, where they used that successfully to kind of match the bite marks to the victim, what they found on the victim.
Yeah.
He was also arrested several times with burglar tools and things like that, because that's part of what you'll see with these kind of individuals, breaking and entering. You'll see it even earlier in life. And sometimes with the psychopath, they may break and enter for the sexual sadist. It's a precursor to the actual behavior of what they're going to do later.
Yeah. And then I think when he was on death row and they were doing all those interviews, I think Harvey Cleckley interviewed him at one point. So that was interesting, or things that I was looking up about Ted Bundy. So, but yeah, pretty much prototypical kind of psychopath, but a completely different in terms of the crimes and the reasons for jail. And Ted Bundy did the crimes in the wrong state. California at some point had the death penalty, and I think Charles Manson was on death row, but then it was changed it while Bundy was in Florida. Wrong state, so they put him to death for that. So and I know he kept trying to, even at the end, kind of manipulate people to kind of stay off the execution, saying, hey, I'll give you more names or crimes and stuff like that. So even to the end, the conning and manipulation was always there for Ted Bundy.
I don't know if did you find in the research, Jason, did he ever actually acknowledge doing things, or did he continue to talk in the third person about, if someone was to do this is who they were, which he did a lot of during his time.
Well, he was a lawyer for himself, right? So that just shows some grandiosity. And I think I watched one video where he blamed it on pornography. Like he blamed everything on pornography. So just the irresponsibility and lack of responsibility for Ted Bundy, even up to the end.
And just to clarify, the pornography isn't what causes this, but it certainly shapes it. In other
Mhm.
words, if you're deviant to begin with and you're looking at a lot of pornography and you get into violent pornography, it can certainly enhance the fantasies.
Mhm.
And the thing about, with Ted Bundy, with the idea of the psychopathy, not all sexual sadists are psychopaths. I mean, in our sample and the article where we did the research comparing non-sexually offending psychopaths to sexual homicide perpetrators to nonviolent pedophiles, all these groups on the Rorschach showed up as being extremely narcissistic and self-centered. However, the sexual homicide perpetrators, only about 2/3 of them were psychopaths. So it's kind of like, Todd, with your idea with Manson, the sexual behavior that was deviant and even at time forcing himself on people and such. It's psychopaths will do that, but it's the sexual homicide perpetrator is a different animal, like the Rorschach clearly shows. And Bundy, this comes up with Bundy, his idea that he could kind of fit in and do things. Well, that comes up on the Rorschach, but you always wonder about fitting in. Yes, if you're superficially show up at the party or go to a job, then you leave. How many people really knew him? Because none of these people really over time can maintain that kind of facade. If you look at Jeffrey Dahmer or other people, it's just they're not looked at very closely. And, they don't spend a lot of time in one place in order to be discovered.
Yeah, it's like they blend in purposefully in order to, analyze or scope out the environment and see if there's something that in that environment that can satisfy them. It's interesting in that regard.
Yes, because when you scratch the surface, but few people scratch the surface. That's one of the reasons Jason and I are doing these podcasts, trying to provide scientific evidence and things and pictures so that people can look at, ask different questions, never doubt their emotional reactions. Excuse me. Both Manson and Bundy at times, people had noticed and made comment on their stare or their eyes being cold, empty, almost reptilian. Even though in your interview with Manson, none of that came out, this is a common thing that people often see. And what Jason and I have cautioned people about, when you get these kind of emotional reactions to people that something isn't right, the hair on the back of your neck stands up, you get something in the pit of your stomach, that if psychologically you're fairly clean, and this isn't something coming from you, is to never ignore those kind of signals or signs, because you're likely picking up on something that's real, but it may not be psychopathy. You could be picking up on someone that's extremely paranoid and anxious and frightened inside, but you could be picking up on someone that's psychopathic. And that kind of empty look in the eyes combined with those emotional reactions would always be something that you would want to explore further. What we've cautioned people is never ignore a behavior and write it off and rationalize it until you fully understand the etiology of the behavior, where it's coming from.
Well, that's asking a lot for, a person that's not exactly oriented in terms of that investigative curiosity.
Well, say more about it, Todd. Yeah, because it's a difficult thing. Now, we do ask a lot, but go ahead and say more about that.
Well, I'm thinking of the reactions I've had with someone. And basically, what tipped me off is they were mirroring me when I was interviewing them. And it kind of raised the back of my, hair on the back of my neck when I realized what he was doing. And so I deliberately started to shift in different ways and confuse them. Because usually, when you interview someone, you're in a position where you're taking notes and you're talking to them, and there's either a desk or there's a space between you and them in a chair. And it was really unnerving. But I recognized that what it was in mirroring, and I recognized that it might have something to do with his pathology, and in particular. So I started paying attention to how people responded to me when I was interviewing them or evaluating them. And
Yes, we're trained to do that.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But not everyone is.
No.
Something has to happen that is so dramatic and so different from what their expectation is in terms of another individual's behavior to make them notice and maybe start questioning. And that seems to be the case, I think, with psychopaths in general, in terms of how they somehow alert others that they aren't exactly functioning on the same level of the wavelength that they are. And so it has to be something that really stands out that tips them off, because they're practiced at practiced at trying to engage people and assess them in terms of what they can get out of them.
And think of Ted Bundy with kind of luring his victims, or sometimes he'd wear a cast and things like this. That Jason
he'd present a sympathetic front, and then and he'd say, "I really need help loading this," and stuff like that. And they'd open up the back of the car or the truck or whatever, and he'd push them in, and that was it.
So I guess maybe I'm just suspicious and been trained to be that way. If someone that I don't know says something, my first question is, why are they asking me this now?
Yeah.
Or what's this about? So I've trained myself, to kind of be like that. But you're right. People tend to be more trusting, I think, in their interactions with others to a fault.
Well, that's our social milieu. We trust people until we can't, I think. And and then when someone's curious, and they're asking you personalized questions and stuff, I had a situation like that, and I realized that the person was genuinely interested, rather than trying to determine whether I was manipulable or not. And, it was in a professional context.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. In terms of generalized interacting with people, I remember when I started working at the prison, I started seeing prison inmates everywhere I went, because they were shaving their heads, they were sagging and bagging. I mean, and of course, that was a style that either started on the streets or started in the prison that transferred itself out. So,
so I think what you're saying is working with these type of people changes your view of society, and I think all three of us would agree with that.
Oh yeah, I mean, it took when I left Pelican Bay, I would get sick every day walking into the prison. I said, that's telling me I really shouldn't be here anymore. Yeah. And then I did go back, but I went back in a highly controlled situation that I commanded, and was able to do the things I was able to do in terms of psychological autopsy and parole evaluations and dangerousness evaluations. And it was very limited, and I could go in and leave when I was done, kind of thing.
Yeah. There's the key to it, though, having that structure and doing that. Well, what were you feeling when you were getting sick, leaving the institution?
Oh, I was throwing up.
Yeah.
I was, I just knew I couldn't be there anymore. It was really affecting me. And
this is the key thing that you see with people like Bundy when you're interacting with them, and some other primitive people and borderline personality disorders and stuff, even in the community. You feel miscast because they're constantly putting their garbage into you.
Yeah.
So your internal world becomes a container for their stuff. And people like Bundy, they will act this out in the stalking phases of their behavior where they do the killings with the idealization, devaluation. They may at a time even picture you as some sort of monster that's worthy of destroying. But they do this stuff to you and you feel these things inside. And as people working in institutions, I found that it was always helpful to have a colleague where you could just walk it up and down the halls and vent that material they would put inside of you. And for people in the world, when they interact, they're going to get feelings like that, not even always with psychopaths, but with disturbed people, where you may feel drained, miscast, used, perplexed, like what was that, or what's happening here, or this isn't me. You'll get those kind of what we call in the profession countertransference reactions, where people are engaging us into these primitive kind of things. I remember working with a high functioning borderline patient. And for people that don't know, the borderline is one of the personality disorders. And she was pretty successful and higher functioning, no drug abuse, no sexual acting out. But at one point during one of the sessions, I saw a change in her expression. And I said to her, well, what did you just hear me say? And then she went on to tell me something she heard me say that was negative and critical, which isn't what I said. And what I said to her, well, that wasn't going on with me, but I wonder if sometimes you feel that way about yourself. Or another example would be this guy on an inpatient, a forensic hospital, a psychopath. We're ready to put him into room seclusion. And he says to me, hey, doc, you like this? And he smiles with a big grin on his face. And what he's doing to me is projecting his sadism onto me, and is expecting me to react based on that projection. Instead, I said, well, you know what? I actually don't enjoy this. In fact, this is taking time away. I could be working with other patients, but given your personality style and what you do, the only way I can help you is helping you to manage and control your anger. At which point he scratched his head and was completely puzzled, because how he wanted me to do, he wanted me to say something punitive or to get angry or act out this cycle.
Yeah, I've had experience with those type of people. And it's as if they're testing you and trying to get you to react to some of the grotesque behaviors that they've committed. And when you don't, it's kind of frustrating, but it forces them to have to change in some respects because there was no reaction where one was expected.
There you go.
It's an unnerving situation when you realize that's what's going on.
Well, it makes you tired, because you're constantly having to deal with these struggles rather than just someone where you go home and can get in your pajamas and sit around with none of that stuff going on. Yeah. And when we talk about these cycles and what they do, this is classic with the sexual homicide perpetrator and people like Bundy. They have these things going on in their head. Dahmer would talk about, he wanted to keep these people around. So you can see they have these primitive cycles that are going on in their mind and psychology that have very little to do with us as a separate object.
Yeah, I think Dahmer was trying to create zombies that would be alive but dead.
They wouldn't leave him. They wouldn't abandon him.
His fantasy, at least,
Yes. He could possess them.
Pardon?
He could possess them.
Yes, exactly.
Not going anywhere.
Yeah.
But I think you guys make a good point is, working with these type of people, especially when they're incarcerated, is very stressful. And we've had the training, people that, see them out in the community and interact with them. They don't know what to look for. They're trusting. And unfortunately, that's why, Bundy had a lot of victims, and anybody else that, kind of fits that prototype would kind of be in that same mindset. But yes, especially in prison setting, they just put everything onto you. Then you're supposed to be, but you always have to be on guard, and you always have to be on your game, because if you don't, that would be, you have a bad reaction, and then they'll run with that. So it's a very difficult population to deal with.
Right, because you carry it with you. And when you're in a culture, which the prison culture is, they got nothing coming. Yeah. What are you talking about? How, I remember an interview, I was interviewing for a higher position, and I started talking about being sex played by inmates, because the big issue is they sex play with women. But then I brought up the fact that they don't, not only do they do it with women, they do it with men, and describe the situation. And it just upset the custody officer in that interview. He just didn't think that was adequate or real or anything. What do you mean you react to stuff like that? But when you're in that environment, a lot of stuff is thrown at you, and you have to manage it.
Yeah, Todd, your point's a good one, because a lot of, in the psychopath's manipulation, what they can manipulate is what's unconscious or you're not comfortable with.
Yeah.
I mean, often they'll say something where they're setting up this kind of power and control issue and doing that. And you just, okay, next question. And they can't catch you. They can't hook you, but they can size up weaknesses and they can know exactly what you're not comfortable with, and they can read you.
Yeah.
And this is part of the manipulation in someone like Bundy. You said finding vulnerable people. He could pick them out of a crowd. Now, if you had 20 people, he would find the one.
Yeah,
that would be, yes.
And that was Manson as well. He could do that.
So this is a psychopath in general, their manipulative skills.
Right.
They can read you and figure out what your weaknesses are. See, if you're okay with your weaknesses, they have nothing to manipulate.
Exactly. Yeah. So you have to have some significant self-knowledge and acceptance of yourself in multiple areas to be able to not respond to that kind of intrusion.
You have to be able to, and it's easier for us to talk about it, even though some of our peers in the mental health profession really are clueless about these issues. But when you're in a structured environment, it becomes much easier to set boundaries and deal with these issues. I can remember one sexual homicide perpetrator getting out of control in the hospital. I said, get the hell out of here. Don't let the door hit you in the ass. We'll come back sometime when you're ready to talk. And he grumbled and left. Or I can remember another guy that when I set limits, I had 6 guards outside the door. See, we're never stupid and bravado on our part. Caution, structure, always, being prepared, because you're expecting these kind of things and you're aware of them. But it is very draining to work in those kind of environments, unless you have outlets for the things they put into you. And obviously, people that were Bundy's victims, I'm sure at some point they became aware of something that wasn't right.
Yeah. When the door slammed after being put in the back of a van. Yeah.
When the guy can walk out of the wheelchair, pretty much, they probably realized, all the things that he would do.
Right.
Him. Yeah. So, I guess the last kind of part for this would be just, I guess, the comparison and contrasting. I guess we kind of did it a little bit, but I guess summarizing maybe some differences that not only. So again, Todd interviewed Manson. We don't have, we've watched a whole bunch of clips and backgrounds on Bundy, but what the Rorschach kind of saw and kind of compare and contrast the two. Carl, I know you had some good insights, and maybe Todd, you want to give some as well.
Yeah, Todd, what were you struck with? And you briefly mentioned it earlier.
Well, I was struck by the texture responses on Bundy, and the aggression in terms of relationships, and the superficiality that allowed him to just appear normal. And then when he was engaging in his fantasy, how purposeful and direct it was. That struck me. Whereas Charlie was kind of ad hoc, he just would respond to whatever situation he was in. His activities weren't all that particularly planned, other than to support himself. And and he, given even his history of arrests and incarceration, he never recognized a situation that would do the same, where he'd put him back himself in prison, unless on some unconscious level, he wanted to be arrested and go back to prison. Bundy, on the other hand, I think was so reckless, and you would think that he would have the capacity or the cognitive ability to recognize, how he was behaving could draw attention to him at some point, and he was oblivious to it, just like Manson was oblivious to his behaviors, attracting legal attention and eventually incarceration.
Well,
Well, you know,
yeah, and I think Bundy, I think he reveled in like all the taunting the police and all that stuff. And I think his grandiosity, he never thought that he would get caught. He escaped twice. He pretty
mhm.
much was like, I'm untouchable. That's what I was kind of feeling. I think he went back to the scene after a couple days after he at the sorority house. So I really thought like he thought he could get away with everything and more planned. But you would think that he would, with the way his cognitions and yeah, the way that he was put together and planned, that he would have a little bit more sense not to get caught.
Well,
Well,
the
when you
piece
think
that's
of
missing,
when you think of a normal person, who's law abiding, they get uncomfortable if they're in a situation that they think might, you know, uh, get them in trouble. I
well,
guess that's what we call conscience in some respects.
Yeah,
But these two people they had none.
yeah,
They didn't have any.
and adding to what both you're saying, Jason, with the grandiosity and that, and then your piece thought about the aggression and the kind of the abnormal bonding and attachment, that drive to be involved in relationships. Bundy couldn't stop himself. He had
No,
all these need states and things pressing him to do this behavior, and he had to do it. So there was nothing going to stop him. If he was in prison for 10 years, probably he would get out and do it again, because these fantasies and all these things pressing to that were part of the complex behavior that he did were there. So it would override any judgment. The rest of his personality was just kind of the right channel,
mhm.
yeah,
the right venue for this to occur. But most people don't have those kind of needs and fantasies
No.
that he developed over a lifetime and then
And
acted out
right.
on.
And then, of course, then he satisfied them time and time again, which emboldened him
There you
yeah,
go.
in terms of his grandiosity.
yeah,
He's emboldened.
yeah.
I can't be held for any of this because I'm so good at it. Probably.
Yeah. And you always wonder about in today's society, these people still exist, but they don't get the attention. It seems like a lot of the murders or things or assaults and things that appear in the media for political reasons. Where in our day, when the media was reporting things honestly, these things became prominent and drew a lot of attention. But these people are operating, and there's people like this out there now.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I would say the only one that I could was similar to was the guy, what was he, Idaho, that had killed a couple of like four students or something. Like I think he
Well,
was going
yeah,
to
the
law school.
criminology PhD student.
Yeah, that had some kind of parallels to kind of Bundy, little higher functioning and things like that. But other than that, yeah, you don't see, the Mansons, the Bundys, the kind of, you know, all the stuff that was going on in California too, the Sunset Killers and all that stuff. Yeah, it doesn't get as much these days as it did back then, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Either a good thing or bad. I would say that'd be a good thing not to glorify all this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. But it's always like the X-Files. The truth is out there.
Hmm. So, Carl, any other comments of comparisons between? I think we kind of showed on the Rorschach, yeah, that they were
I
good.
think we
Yeah.
covered the main points between the three of us.
Yeah.
The grandiosity and this desire for attachment that shouldn't be there, and the fantasy life and all the unmet needs and things pressing on Rorschach for expression. They just make a perfect storm for this kind of behavior.
Yeah.
And you don't wake up one day with this. You kind of develop it over time and shape it.
Yeah. And
Yeah, I think
go ahead, Tom.
I was going to say with Manson, he had the desire for a relationship with only one person, his mother, and he was able to detect longing and loneliness in individuals that he could exploit because he understood what that emotion was like for himself. That I think he channeled into survival skills and the like. in the prison population as well as when he was on the streets.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely a much different contrast than
Yeah.
Ted Bundy. And obviously, but I think it was 1989 that he was executed. I wonder how long he would have lasted if he wasn't. I wonder, I know Manson was in his 80s. I wonder what Bundy would have done and how he would have handled prison
Yeah.
in the long term. That would have been interesting to see.
Yeah, because he wasn't like Manson, where prison was his home.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he would probably try to escape him multiple times, I would imagine. So, one last thing, Todd, I think kind of going back to that kind of interview style. Obviously, when you were interviewing Manson, and obviously, I assumed you know about his reputation and his fame. How did you handle that when you were assessing him? How did that go? Like, able
Well,
to put that aside and things like that, or
I was able to set it aside. I knew, um, I knew about his reputation. I had read Helter Skelter years ago, and I reread it as part of the evaluation because of stuff that was available at the time. But I set it aside because I did not want to be influenced by it. So I was aware if I was going to be enthralled, if that's a reasonable term to think about. I saw it as an opportunity. I took the scientific practitioner approach because I was collecting data that I knew at some point in time would be important in understanding his behavior as well as similar type behaviors. And I felt that was the duty of my scientist practitioner approach.
and you were kind of on. I'm sorry. Yep, go ahead.
And that's how I handled it. That was my approach, and it's gathering information that I knew would be important.
And it sounds like too that we just talked about just kind of being unaware if he was going to try to do any manipulation, but it sounds like he didn't kind of do any of that stuff, but just being aware of behaviors or for mirroring back or anything like that. Yeah.
I had a sense of that when I first met him because he knew who I was. He had asked around the cellmates where he was housed who I was, so he knew who I was when he walked in to see me, and it did not put me off my guard.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So that was kind of what he was trying to get at that in that beginning.
I think so. I think so. Yeah, he even told me one time what car I drove. So that told me he looked out what small window he had, which was viewed the circular drive around the prison. And he told me at one point what car I was driving. And I said, well, I know how you did that, and it does not bother me at all. And
There
I think
you go.
level he was trying to bother me a little bit.
Right.
Yeah. Very good. Okay.
Yeah.
So, any closing comments, Todd or Carl, about Ted Bundy and Charles Manson? Obviously, they're probably two of the most infamous psychopaths, I guess, in the United States. Yeah. Any closing comments?
I think we covered a lot, to be honest with you. And so I don't know what I would say in closing that other than to hope that this has been enlightening for practitioners and for those lay people. Interesting, and put them, make them a little aware of some of the people they interact with.
Yeah.
Especially in social situations, in legal situations, as well as religious situations, because individuals with these tendencies seem to flock to those particular professions. So,
yeah,
and politicians.
And that's a great point because I think we mentioned it before. Bob Hare always talks about 1% of the North American population is psychopathic. So that is not, all those people are not incarcerated. They are, there's definitely quite a few in prisons, but there's a lot in the daily lives that you would see. So yes, it's very important that it can be anywhere. You can be at the grocery store, at church, or, going to work, and might be interacting with some of these people.
Yeah.
And Carl, anything else?
I like what Todd said. I like this idea the relationship dynamic came up with kind of how they project and do things to us and how you need to prepare. When Todd was talking about that, preparing for the interview, and basically he was what we would call transparent, even though Manson saw his card, didn't really, it was like no big deal.
Mhm.
I found that being somewhat obsessive compulsive is helpful because I can compartmentalize different issues the same way handling interviewing these people. Where you go in, you have the structure of knowing why you're there, what the purpose is. You're not going to let certain things occur, certain things may occur, and you're basically okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very well. All
Okay.
right. So thank you, Todd. Carl, again, thank you for the podcast. So we'll end it here. So anybody that, again, would like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, we'll have some more future episodes. In the description, there'll be a link to the article that we compared Bundy and Manson for. And you can always go to maverickpsychology.com if you want to get a hold of us. Please feel free to like and subscribe and send any comments, and we'll could answer them in a future podcast. Thank you again, Todd, for joining us, and I hope it has been fun. And we'll see you next time.
Okay. Take care.
Take care.